Thanks, Alistair. So I'm actually going to try and sneak in a bit of Locke and sort of early Enlightenment thinkers as well as Rousseau and Kant. So I'm going to be a bit pushed for time, so I'm going to try and dive in. But in terms of an overview of what I wanted to talk about today is to try and get an idea of what's unique about the concept of the self as it emerges in Enlightenment thought. And I think in a nutshell, to give the game away, that I think it's a picture of a self emerging out of nature and nature's determinations into society, but still sort of caught in freeze frame between the two, giving a divided, contradictory, internally contradictory, paradoxical view of the self that nonetheless shows us the beginnings of ideas of authenticity and autonomy, freedom and self-government, the self and society. And the human subject in this period was placed for the first time squarely front and centre in the middle of the world, creating a temptation or an impulse, if you like, to remake that world in one's own image, in a human form. So I want to sketch over three topics. Firstly, what you might call scientific or earlier Enlightenment views of the self and society. Secondly, to sort of talk a bit about Rousseau and then Kant. Not trying to create a synthesis of the two of them, but just to put some key aspects of their thought up against each other to give an impression of the period, and to try and say that maybe there's a reaction in those two thinkers against earlier materialist and more reductionist accounts of the self. They recognize the complexity and paradox of the self, a self torn between passion and reason, reliant on both thinking and feeling, and both of those things as being necessary for understanding. And thirdly, then to talk about the relationship of the self and society, that sort of unresolvable and productive tension that exists between the self and other selves within the boundaries of a society. And that's it, I suppose. So we'll just crack on through those. The first contradiction that appears in Enlightenment thinking about the self, I suppose, is almost a sort of a double contradiction. Firstly, there are these earlier, more scientific thinkers, and then those who come later. So as I hinted at, I think the earlier ones take a broadly more materialist view of the self. They try and reduce the self to a physical basis. But they're always struggling with the fact that no matter how much we try and explain ourselves away in terms of our biology and causality of nature, we always struggle with the fact that at the end of the day, we always appear to ourselves to be unique. We can always turn our thoughts back upon ourselves. We can self-reflect. We can disagree with ourselves. We can be split. We can be apart from oneself. And as selves, we can appear to stand apart both from nature and also from the human world. We don't always seem to fit in as part of that feeling unique. There's just something about us that means we don't fit in. We appear more as a sort of a question or a problem or a dilemma sometimes. And one of the forms that question takes is, how can it be that we are a material thing of flesh and blood here in the world in time and space, subject to external forces, to physical propulsion and so on, but also at the same time, under another aspect, if you like, an active subject who acts on the world around one and has a role in shaping it and changing it. We stand apart from the animal world because we're not fully determined by our desires and our instincts. There's a residuum of intent left over and above desire. That means that we can determine what we want. We can determine our own ends and what we think is good for us. Again, part of what makes us unique. And part of this contradiction is that later Enlightenment thinkers maybe have a greater interest in emotion and what we feel and intuit and in conscience, but also in the power of ideas independent of experience. So they don't hold that there's a simple causal relationship between what happens in the world, what we experience, what happens to us, and what we think. We're not determined by what happens to us. So they reject attempts to reduce the moral to the physical, to explain ought in terms of is, and in doing so I think they move the human subject into a different relationship to the world in which he finds himself than had been previously considered. Some move, I think Frank mentioned Schelling, but certainly Fichte later, some move very far towards a purely subjectivist, idealist account of the human subject, and some even anticipate and prefigure some of the themes that we'll be looking at in later lectures in this academy. Relativism, the importance of the figure of the other, and the question of identity. But there's this contradiction between materialist then and idealist conceptions of the self, which does speak to our everyday experience of being in a world that we didn't completely make and is not completely under our control, even though we can imagine that it might be. And there's a contradiction as well between two views of the relationship of the self and society in this period. On one hand, there's an earlier view that the self and society are not terms in conflict, but that individual self-interest is providentially organized to work out to the benefit of society. There's in the religious sense, God's plan means that we will act in ways that benefit us all. Society is harmoniously ordered for the benefit of those who live in it. And then there's a later view, maybe most associated with Rousseau, is that society, quite far from benefiting the individual, corrupts the individual. That moral and civil liberty are distinct, if not at odds. That man is autonomous only insofar as he is autonomous, keeps his distance from society. And the stress is placed on the individual in this line of thinking rather than on society. The individual sort of comes first, at least logically. And to point up the contrast, maybe a Locke or an Adam Smith thinks that the self and society can advance together, whereas a Kant appears to put all the stress on the advancement of the self through reason alone. Well, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. He certainly admits to the situation being a bit more complex than that, and those who were in the earlier lecture by Teresa Bejan will have seen a quote from Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment, where there's a list of people being told what to do all the time. Don't argue, get on parade, don't argue, pay your taxes. And Kant saying, well, we need to be able to argue. That's the basis of enlightenment, the public use of reason. She didn't flag up the sort of sentence that ends that paragraph, where Kant says, only an enlightened monarch like Frederick the Great could say to us, argue as much as you like, but obey. And so the two things kind of go together for Kant. So maybe it's not quite so straightforward, and we'll come on to that later, to the idea that we may be free in the virtue of our reason allowing us to act against our instincts. But it follows from that freedom then presents itself to us in the form of a demand, coming from outside, as it were, an imperative that we have no choice but to obey. But I think Rousseau and Kant can be read as having very divergent views of the self. This is just sort of warm-up. We'll come into this in a bit more detail, but it's just to get you thinking about them. Rousseau, that man is corrupted by society, starting from a natural state of perfection and goodness, he degenerates as civilization advances. And in Kant, almost the opposite, that man is in a process of self-perfection, and maybe an unending process, but a process of getting better all the time through the increasing public use of his reason. And I just flag up those two different views to raise the question, if they have such divergent views of man in society, why was it that Rousseau was Kant's sort of model, the one who sort of inspired him in many ways? Famously, the only image on display in Kant's house was a picture of Rousseau. So he was inspired by him in many ways. And there's a question, I think, that we can bear in the back of our minds in terms of what do they share about thinking, in terms of their thinking about man's capacity for reason as being the basis for morality. Something underpinned in Rousseau's thought by the faculty of conscience. So it's not all about a decline in society. There comes a point, if there is enough public use of reason, even in Rousseau's thinking, then we can start to do the right thing once we've become more developed as social rather than natural human beings. And in the end, I think we might look at discussing what it is about the subject, largely freed by the advances of civilization from the constraints and determinations of nature, that leads us into this temptation or impulse or illusion, perhaps, as Kant would have it, that man can achieve free control over anything that restricts his, full control over anything that restricts his freedom. That determinations can be removed and that we can do whatever we imagine. What is it about man's self-understanding that leads him to try and reject the conditions in which he finds himself, and in the process sometimes reject himself and his fellow men? So that's the argument in a nutshell. To go back to those earlier scientific Enlightenment thinkers, I'm going to pick on sort of John Locke. He had a tabula rasa approach to the self. Man is a blank slate in the beginning. I think Frank mentioned this. There's nothing innate about man. Man is to be written on by his experience of the world. That's the argument put forward in the essay concerning human understanding. And in this sense, one's ideas and oneself is shaped by and conforms to the way the world is. We are fitted in, if you like, by the world. Now, so far so good, but Locke also holds that as well as receiving sense impressions from the world around us, one also has this faculty of introspection, an ability to have a conversation of the self with the self. And this ability and the resultant feeling of separateness, of being apart from the world, must be there, because if I can ask myself what I think about the world, therefore it follows that I can disagree with it and myself. And this ability for Locke is founded on memory. What matters is the continuity of the association of the self with its own memories. And that allowed him to separate out the soul from the self. The self is something that depends on the ability to introspect, to remember who you are, and a consciousness of being the same person through the passage of time, whereas the soul is an eternal thing, a gift from God. And we can almost sort of put that on one side once we've got this new concept of the self. But the major problem that Locke faced with this kind of theory is that memories are distorted, memories are lost, partial, and incomplete. And as well as the problem with memory as a faculty, the world itself exhibits a certain degree of instability, contingency, and randomness. Think of all those sense impressions flooding in upon you. What do they mean in themselves? What do they impress upon us, other than the blast of colour and complexity? In contradistinction to the sort of inner unity and stability of the self that we feel on a day-to-day basis. I don't seem to, be changing all that quickly. Nobody put their hand up earlier on in terms of question of changing identity. But nonetheless, people tried to pursue this line of argument of trying reducing the self to the empirical and the material. The French thinker Condillac, in his Traité de Sensation, 1754, tried to fully find a basis for reflection and introspection in sensation, in the faculties of smell, sight, and touch. But even he couldn't find a way to explain a certain necessary gap or leap that happens. In the way he puts it, he says, while I see myself, I touch myself, in one word, I experience myself, but still I do not know what I am. There remained this sort of ambiguous, this unbridgeable divide between one's sense of self as being unique, as me, and one's physical constitution. Some tried to deny the problem or overcome it simply by denying the existence of both soul and self. Julien Offroy de La Mettrie wrote a book called L'Homme Machine in 1748, when he argued man was just a form of automaton. And Baron Paul de Holbach wrote a book called Le Système de la Nature in 1770. The book was burnt by the public hangman in Paris because of its argument that the human body is entirely made up of matter. All packed together so tightly that there just wasn't any room for a soul in there. So that was his proof it couldn't be possible. We were fully material. Man was an entirely physical being. His moral dimension, nothing more than his physical existence considered under a certain point of view, as to say, relative to what he does. So it's a behaviorist account, I suppose, of the self. And for Dolbach, man was driven by nothing more than instinctual self-preservation. There's no room for freedom in this thesis at all. Man must, I quote, submit in silence to laws from whose binding force nothing can remove him. Now, for these thinkers, then, the interests of the self and the interests of society still tended to come together in what was known as this providential view. Kenneth Malick quotes Alexander Pope's essay on Man on this. Thus, God and nature linked the general frame, and bade self-love and social be the same. But what started to happen, I think, in 18th century thinking was some of this optimism gave way to a degree of pessimism. Sometimes people hook it around the Lisbon earthquake, a view that society was maybe not ordered for the best, that reason alone might not be enough to change society for the better, and that progress was maybe not always inevitable, nor necessarily always for the good. And part of the problem was to be found in the way we were in ourselves. Now, Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Autobiography, published after his death because he wanted no restrictions on what he was going to say, was designed to be the truest portrait of a man ever. His confessions, written between 1782 and 89, are, he says, the story of an enterprise without precedent and beyond imitation, though it promptly had many imitators, including Wordsworth's Prelude, for example. But he begins, my purpose is to display to my kind a portrait in every way true to nature, and the man I shall portray will be myself. Simply myself, moi sol. I know my own heart and understand my fellow man, but I am made unlike anyone I have ever met. I will even venture to say that I am like no one else in the whole world. I may be no better, but at least I am different. Au moins, je suis autre. At least I am other. I'm not reducible to anything. Now, his declaration that he is made unlike anyone I have ever met might be lacking in a certain humility, but I think it's honest. I think we all feel that about ourselves. Ourselves are our own, individual and unique. They're not communal. Rousseau set out to tell everything, to relate what he called this immense chaos of feeling, to confess everything, the good, the bad, in sum, everything. And he does go on to confess to an increasingly shocking, well, at least for him, shocking series of failings, which range from stealing an apple, and then it's a slippery slope, he's stealing an asparagus next. He graduates then to stealing a theatre ticket. It's getting a bit more serious, especially given he was really down on the theatre. Before you know it, he's consorting with prostitutes, and then he's putting his illegitimate babies into a foundling hospital, which was pretty much a death sentence, 5 of them. There's no narrative arc in this story, no sort of redemptive path followed, no order in this sort of catalogue of sentiment, except, I suppose, the order and the centre provided by our narrator himself. The world throws events at him, he survives, the world changes and moves on, his consciousness floats above it, certain always of being right, with an increasing level of paranoia and distrust of his fellow man, certain that everyone's out to get him, certain always of his superiority and difference to those around him. And the end of the Confessions, in a way, draws a stark portrait of a man alone, withdrawn from and fleeing a society that partly is true and partly was his imagination, shunned him for what he thought. And even unable, at the end of all these confessions, to provoke a reaction from society. You know, he bears his soul to the world, and in this case he imagines himself reading the confessions out loud to a society of a group of society ladies. He can't even get a reaction out of them. When he finishes reading, he says, I concluded my reading, and everyone was silent. Mademoiselle d'Egmont was the only person who seemed moved. She trembled visibly, but quickly controlled herself, and remained quiet, as did the rest of the company. So if ever there was a man who didn't fit in, right, it was Rousseau. So why is this? Going back to some of his earlier writing, when he was 37, he had what he called was an illumination while he was walking to Vincennes, where Diderot was staying. Diderot had been imprisoned there because of his irreligious writing. And Rousseau would go on this daily walk to see Diderot, and the summer was excessively hot. So he says, in order to slacken my pace, I thought of taking a book with me. One day I took the Mercure de France, and glancing through it as I walked, I came upon this question propounded by the Dijon Academy for the next year's prize. Has the progress of the sciences and arts done more to corrupt morals or improve them? The moment I read this, I beheld another universe and became another man. So there's a clear allusion to Saul Paul on the road to Damascus. He has this revelation and he becomes a new person. And the resulting and winning essay was his first discourse on the sciences and the arts, in which he argues that man's increasing civilization walked hand in hand with his moral decay. Man, good by nature, is corrupted by the society in which he lives. Now, I don't think that his argument is really a primitivist one, that, as it is so often caricatured, that there's any sense in which we could go back to a golden age of the noble savage. I think he's just making a logical argument. You can judge whether or not you think it's correct, but I think his argument is a logical one, that man left on his own is independent and therefore free. He is dependent on no one else. So man in the woods on his own is free. He relies on himself alone and is subject only to the laws of his own making. He has an instinctual drive to self-preservation, which Rousseau calls amour de soi, self-love, and which consists in reusing reason to tend to one's own needs. So far, so good. Man in the company of others, however, becomes prey to what Rousseau calls amour propre, which also means self-love, but we call it love of self, in English, pride or vanity. And this is the business of relations with other selves, which leads to a comparison of our respective situations. It starts off as a comparison of our relative attractiveness to members of the opposite sex in this sort of development of society. We compete for the favours of the fair. And this self-interested drive is about one's relative success or failure as a social being. It's related to a demand for recognition and respect for what one has achieved, often relative to getting one over on the other guy. And as society continues to develop, men became increasingly prone to giving and receiving flattery, Rousseau argues, and to misrepresentation of one's own beliefs and desires. What one really wants is misrepresented in order to fit in, to receive the social flattery and material advancement and good things that go with getting ahead in society. So we sort of lie to each other about what we really want so we can fit in, so we can get these good things, and we attain socially valued ends which are seen as being somehow in conflict with our real ends. The result is frustration, self-alienation, what Sartre would call bad faith. 5 years later, Rousseau's in retreat from Paris. He's moving around Europe, Geneva, hiding out. He publishes The Social Contract, which begins... Rousseau had clearly read Kant's What is Enlightenment, which is about to be published 30 years later, because he begins it in exactly the same way. If you think of Kant's What is Enlightenment, begins with man is in a condition of self-imposed immaturity, and enlightenment is the ability to get out of our self-imposed immaturity. Rousseau begins 30 years earlier The Social Contract by saying, with the opening sort of shattering sentence, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Many a man believes himself to be the master of others, who is, no less than they, himself a slave. So the question is posed, how can we be free if we are indeed slaves? How can the tension between the freedom of the individual and the authority of the state and the situation in which man finds himself ever be reconciled? Rousseau's answer in the Social Contract is in terms of the concept of the general will. We sacrifice something in terms of individual independence, but we get paid back in terms of republican liberty. So this republican liberty is based on obedience to a self-imposed law, an autonomously generated law based on the general will of all citizens who will and want the same thing. So in obeying the law, each citizen thus becomes subject to his or her own will, to each other's will, and therefore, according to Rousseau, remains free. The problem, and many people have made this criticism of Rousseau's concept of the general will, is that it's an entirely artificial concept. It doesn't exist anywhere. You can't find it. It's sort of a mechanism, if you like, put in place to deny the reality of conflicting interests within society. And I suppose the problem is best expressed by Rousseau having to have recourse to arguments that are clearly paradoxical, arguing that man must be forced to be free, that it is the law that makes him, that must coerce him to realize his true interests, forced to realize his true interests. He's arguing, I suppose, in short, a form of juridical activism that good laws make good citizens. But he's aware that the citizens we actually have back in society, in the real world, live under bad laws. And to some extent, they're therefore bad citizens too, and can't actually be relied upon to draft good laws. So his get-out-of-jail-free card in this situation is, to some extent, through a figure that appears called the Legislator. A bit like the tutor in his book on education, Emile. The Legislator persuades citizens through non-rational means to legislate in their own interests. The legislator must be possessed, Rousseau says, of a superior intelligence which can survey all the passions of mankind, though itself exposed to none, which is a sort of a remote perspective from nowhere, a view from nowhere. The legislator cannot, in speaking to the vulgar herd, you and me, even use the language of the vulgar herd, because excessive generalizations and long-range views are beyond the comprehension of the average man. Instead, the legislator must, since he can use neither force nor argument, have recourse to authority of a different kind which can lead without violence and persuade without convincing. Now, he's talking about a position that I think we can recognize some aspects of today, and he's really grappling with a very profound problem, is that the way things are organized maybe not have been done by us, and it may not be the best organization. How can we improve it without throwing everything away? And he can't really bridge that gap. He needs this figure of a legislator to come in. How am I doing for time?
Another 12 minutes.
And when we've had 12 minutes, how many minutes will that have been?
Sorry?
How many minutes will that get me to? We haven't even done Kant yet. Right, we'll go into Kant. Kant was so struck reading Rousseau's Emile that it was the idea of human nature being intrinsically good that caused Kant to be put off his daily walk for several days while he tried to think this through. And his response to Rousseau was that his idea that the moral law is written in the human heart. And there's a famous quote, which I think some of it ends up on his gravestone, but this is from the Critique of Practical Reason. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and steadily we reflect upon them: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. I do not seek or conjecture either of them as if they were veiled obscurities or extravagances beyond the horizon of my vision. I see them before me and connect them immediately with the consciousness of my existence. So he's making an appeal to a faculty of reason that he thinks is inherent in all of us, which allows us to act freely against our natural instincts. So this idea of reason is not there through nature, but it's in some sense ideal, super or anti-natural, and therefore not determined. It's free. There's something, he argues, about the way the human subject and the natural object are structured that allows the possibility of us bridging that divide, metaphysical divide between the two. And he does that by arguing that we need both sensation and understanding to make judgments. A thinking being needs to be pre-armed with concepts. Kant's thinking about concepts like substance, causality, and temporality, in order to be able to think in the first place. If you haven't got those concepts, you don't get off the ground. And in that sense, he thinks the empiricists are mistaken. Sensation is not enough. You have to have concepts to start with. But at the same time, he would argue, without sensation, there wouldn't be anything to think about. We need intuitions and concepts both, but it's those concepts that sort of come first and underpin the very possibility of thought. But, and to bring it back to the self, the only thing we can ever really be sure of is that my point of view is my point of view. I can't be mistaken about the fact that my experiences are my experiences. There's a unity of my self-consciousness that comes before the world. I'm not given my self-consciousness as it presents itself to me is not given to me by the world. It's a presupposition of experience itself. It's not a fact of experience, something given to me. In a way, I create what I experience. It's me that brings order and chaos to the chaos of sensory data and experience. Now, we can get things... we'll skip the bit about getting things wrong. It doesn't matter. There's a limit to this knowledge, though, in that we can only know a priori things about the world insofar it is possible for those things to present themselves to our point of view as an appearance. So this is the distinction he makes between phenomena, what appears to us, what we can see and judge, and noumena, or the things in themselves which we can't get to. That would be the business of pure reason, but we don't have that. We have limited or practical reason. But, and this maybe goes back to the point that Frank made this morning, we can imagine things from the point of view of pure reason. Because we have a perspective on the world as human beings, it means that we can imagine the point of view, we can imagine the world seen from no perspective whatsoever. We can imagine a world seen from no point of view at all, a completely objective, unconditioned viewpoint is something I can say, and hopefully it makes some sense as a possibility, but you couldn't actually do it because you only have your own perspective. But we can imagine this absolute freedom. And it's a matter, I suppose, of being able to see oneself under two aspects at the same time. As a thing, governed by the laws of nature and causality, I appear. I'm a thing in my appearance. I look like a thing to you. But also I'm a thing in itself, independent of the laws of nature. And I can see both those things as I think about myself and look at myself. Freedom then becomes the ability to be governed by reason. Our autonomy is reliant on our ability to ignore the promptings of self-interest and instinct and desire where they conflict with my reason, which means that we're governed by a causality of freedom as well as the causality of nature. Now, this leads us to, and I'll sort of start to conclude here, and there's more we can come back to in the discussion, but this leads us to that paradoxical point in Kant at least, which I'm not going to try and resolve, but just sort of state, is that what does he mean by saying we should both argue and obey? And actually, at the end of his essay, What is Enlightenment?, he explicitly points up this paradox and says it's a paradox. He says, a high degree of civil freedom seems advantageous to a people's intellectual freedom. Yet, it also sets up insuperable barriers to it. Conversely, a lesser degree of civil freedom gives intellectual freedom enough room to expand to its fullest extent. Only once this ability to act freely has developed within what Kant thinks is a necessary security of what he calls a hard shell of protection, which needs to be afforded to man's inclination to think freely, only then may governments find that they can themselves profit by treating man, who is more than a machine, in a manner appropriate to his dignity. So he asks himself the question, are we living in an age of enlightenment? He says no, we're not, but we're emerging always into enlightenment. And while we emerge, like chicks, we need a mother hen. and his mother hen is Frederick the Great, I suppose. He says we need an enlightened ruler to give us that safety in order to dream without sort of going too quickly. He says we need an enlightened ruler who has a well-disciplined and numerous army to guarantee public security. And it's that position that allows the enlightened monarch to say what this is Kant, to say what no republic would dare to say. Argue as much as you like and about whatever you like, but obey. And he's saying that we should have the complete freedom to argue whatever we like in public, but in private we need to do our duty. Society would fall apart if the soldier doesn't obey orders, if the citizen doesn't pay his taxes. Because he focuses quite heavily on religion in this essay, he says he creates a very stark picture of a preacher who should do his duty in church on a Sunday, preaching to his flock the word of God, but on Monday should be out writing essays saying, I'm not sure about this revealed religion thing. And that would be fine. The two seen under two different aspects, I suppose. It's the one, a person in society where there's certain ways of living together that should be followed because they're the ways of living together. Obey those. But in public, argue about everything. So pay your taxes and then make your argument about why the taxes are unfair and unjust. But pay your taxes regardless. Now, what he's getting at here, and I'll sort of bring it to a close here, I think, is that we need to do two things. The transcendental point of view that we're afforded by our ability to feel apart from the world and look at it from our point of view and imagine it as being different provides us with an ability to test the world against our ideals, to use our reason and to say, what would the world be like if it was like this? Well, it would be better. And that we can look to move society along to meet with those ideals. But at the same time, we have to realize that these are ideals and not real. And if we just tried to apply them to the world as we actually find it, or to the crooked timbers of humanity, as Kant has it, we'll run into contradiction and error and problems. So I think he's arguing that we need this sort of restricted civil liberty, or certain restrictions on our freedom, at least to the extent in we are rule following in the private sphere. We need those in order to afford us the intellectual freedom to work out ever simpler and wider and more universal laws, which help us render the empirical world more and more intelligible. And that becomes a virtuous cycle, if you like. But you can't just jump ahead to the end game of bringing in the legislator who's worked it all out beforehand. So for Kant, it's more of a process. We, bit by bit, we will universalize our understanding and simplify the world in which we live, which will allow us bit by bit to live more freely. And that, I think, is a more positive and progressive vision of, such as it is for its time, it's a more positive and progressive vision maybe than Rousseau gives us, who, in his Emile, argues that everything is good as it leaves the hands of the author of things, but everything degenerates in the hands of man. Society corrupts the individual, and Rousseau argues that education, Emile has got a tutor who's educating him. Education must be put in the hands of experts in order to socialize man in such a way that his goodness is not destroyed. But for Kant, I think he's allowing more of a development from within that doesn't necessarily put us into that problem. Though, and I'll finish on this, is that Rousseau also ends Emile by saying, and I think he's right on this, society must be studied in the individual and the individual in society. And he is at times aware of that relationship not being one of independence between the two parts of it, but society, and I sort of nod back to what Teresa was saying earlier, society isn't a thing over there. It's made up of people within it, like us, and at its simplest, society is two people relating to each other. And the question of how they live together and balance their particular desires against the desires of both of them, the particular against the universal, is the question that we're trying to grapple with, finding ways. As Frank put it better than me this morning, I think the challenge that the still posed, that the Enlightenment thinkers were posing, is how can we find ways that allow our subjectivity and our individuality and our uniqueness to voluntarily, self-willingly, autonomously move forward to shared communal ways of living together with agreed normative values for how we interrelate.